There we go.
We're probably all familiar with We Three Kings of Orient Are, which I used to think was Orientar type of paving material. In any case, it turns out that the Magi, M-A-G-I, plural of the word magus, not necessarily three. We get three from the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but 3 or 4 people could have brought myrrh or frankincense. And we get kings from a misidentification of the Magi with some prophetic traditions. The Magi aren't kings. That would be counterintuitive for Matthew. It would be counterintuitive for Luke. Luke talks about kings being brought down. Matthew talks about the lords of the earth who lord it over us. Matthew doesn't like kings. Matthew likes people who establish a kingdom where everybody has equal rights and reigns together with God. The Magi are not necessarily three, they're not necessarily kings, and the idea of they're representing different parts of the world, it's a lovely story, but it's not the story Matthew tells. For Matthew, the Magi are simply Magi. They are Persian or Chaldean or Babylonian astrologers. Today, the word Magi is still being used. Magi today are Zoroastrian priests. And here we have a bit of a problem, because Matthew makes a little bit of fun of these Magi, and we should not be making fun of other people's religions. In terms of the Magi in Matthew, I like to refer to them as Larry, Moe, and Curly. There may not be 3 of them, but it seems to work. They are what we might call fools for Christ. They ask precisely the wrong questions, they act precisely the wrong way, and somehow it all works out to the good. According to the CEB, the story of the Magi begins like this. I'm in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea during the reign of King Herod, and remember that King Herod because kingship will be important, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem, and they asked, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east, or at its rising, and we come to honor him." Matthew stresses Herod, King of the Jews, and he repeats King of the Jews over and over again. When the Magi come to Jerusalem and ask, "Where is the King of the Jews?" that is the most impolitic, indeed dangerous, and perhaps silly question they could possibly ask, because Herod thinks he's King of the Jews, and he recognizes now there may be a challenge. So through the Magi's unwittingly silly, impolitic question, the plot begins. When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, as one might imagine, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. So Herod gathers the experts in the court and says, "Who's this newborn king and where is he supposed to be?" Herod is ostensibly king of the Jews, and he doesn't even know his own Jewish tradition. And the wise men in the court say, "Oh yeah, we know where this newborn king is supposed to be. According to the prophet Micah, the son of David, the Messiah, this newborn king, will be born in Bethlehem, the city of David." So the Magi now know where to go. Prophecy is being fulfilled. And as we see throughout the Christmas story in Matthew, as we already saw regarding the prediction of the virginal conception, pretty much everything in Matthew's nativity material is footnoted. Matthew is firmly anchoring his stories into the scriptures of Israel. Herod tells the Magi, "Listen, go find this king, and when you find him, come back and let me know." Completely disingenuous. If you think the Messiah is born, you don't wait for the Magi to come back. And the Magi, unaware that Herod actually has murderous intentions, had actually planned to do this. So the Magi pick up the star, which seems to be functioning like a GPS. That immediately tells us that the star is not what we would call a star. For Matthew, for people in the first century, stars were not enormous balls of hydrogen gas. Stars back then were understood to be the remains, the new bodies of righteous people who shine like the stars in heaven. A star is a sentient being, which is why you can follow it. And as we're told according to the Gospel of Matthew, when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. That's when the star stopped. The CEB is less clear than some other translations, which read something to the effect of, when the Magi saw that the star had stopped, they rejoiced with great joy. They remind me of the kids in the back seat saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" They're delightful, but the star drops them off by standing over the house. And so we know that the star is not a real star, because if a real star stops directly over your house, as it usually does in the Christmas cards, that house will be incinerated, as will the rest of the globe. In order fully to understand Matthew, we have to understand how people in the first century understood prophecy, understood stars, understood Magi, and understood royal rule. When the Magi enter the house, they find the baby and Mary, his mother. I'd like the idea that perhaps Mary was nursing the child or maybe changing a diaper. This is a real baby. They drop off what we would today call the Christmas gifts, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. And people throughout history have come up with, what do these things symbolize? Gold because you need money, you've got a new child. Frankincense to make the room smell better. And myrrh sometimes I understood to deworm the child or some sort of health thing. But we just take them as gifts, and they're very high-end gifts. So the Magi drop off these gifts, and they're ready to go back to Herod, but typical for Matthew here, the Magi are warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, but to go somewhere else, not to tell Herod where the child has been born. And the Magi leave the text, and they wander out of the text, and I picture them still out there, perhaps following another star. I think Matthew's idea here is that these representatives of foreign knowledge, foreign wisdom, astrology back then was considered a science. Foreign wisdom, science can only get you so far. To get to the full meaning of the way the world functions, science is insufficient. You need revelation. When Herod realized he had been tricked by the Magi, and we don't know how long this took, 6 months, a year, 2 years, he becomes very nervous because he believes this prophecy of the newborn king. And he sends his soldiers to Bethlehem, and they kill all the children aged 2 years and younger. And there's a big difference between a 2-year-old and a newborn. Joseph had been warned in a dream to take the baby and flee to Egypt. Jesus survives when children around him are slaughtered. What would that have meant to him personally, knowing that other people died and he lived? What responsibility does he have? And then what responsibility do we who tell the story have? By setting Jesus in this context, Matthew is showing us that Jesus is like a new Moses. At the time of Moses' birth, Pharaoh in Egypt had ordered all the Hebrew babies thrown into the Nile, and Moses is the one who survives. Joseph and Mary take the child to Egypt, again echoing the story of Moses. And Matthew then brings in another fulfillment quotation, which is both profound and prescient. Matthew tells us that when all these children are killed, this fulfilled the words spoken through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and much grieving, Rachel weeping for her children, and she did not want to be comforted because they were no more. The quotation is from Jeremiah chapter 31, the New Covenant passage. It would have been well known to Jews at the time. It would have been well known to Jesus' followers. And I think Matthew was encouraging us, anytime there's a fulfillment quotation where we read, this was done to fulfill, or the prophet said, Matthew says, go back and look at the original text, because the prophecy is only half the story. If we go back and we look at Jeremiah chapter 31, again here from the CEB, after we read, because her children are no more, the very next verse in Jeremiah, the Lord proclaims, keep your voice from crying and your eyes from weeping, because your endurance, your steadfastness will be rewarded, declares the Lord. They will return from the land of their enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children will return home. Jeremiah is talking about the return of the Jews who had been exiled to Babylon in the 6th century. But for Matthew, perhaps this image of the children coming home, these dead children, these martyred children, I think for Matthew that means resurrection. That the story is not over, that there is ongoing life and steadfastness, belief, earnestness, proclamation, all will be rewarded. The Christmas story is only the start of something more glorious and more wonderful and more profound. The more we hear it in a first century context, the more meaningful it becomes. Christmas story is just so full of wonderful material. We've only looked at some of it. We talked about the Annunciation to Zechariah, his relationship with Elizabeth, the echoes of Old Testament scriptures. We talked about Mary giving birth. We talked about the angel. We talked about the trip from Nazareth because of the census. We talked about the Magi. We talked about the danger to the child's life. We talked about fulfillment of prophecy. We talked about stars and the census and the travel. And there's so much more. There's the rest of the story of John the Baptist. There are the genealogies which anchor Jesus to the scriptures and the people of Israel. There's the rest of the story of Joseph, indeed the story of Mary, who continues through the Gospels and then on into church history. These stories gave rise to other stories, and they also depend on stories of the Hebrew Scriptures. We start with the first two chapters of Matthew and Luke, but those chapters are embedded in a much larger story. And this tells us that Advent, that Christmas, is not all there is. One can't be a follower of Jesus and just do Christmas and Easter and forget everything in between. Fully to be a follower of Jesus, fully to understand this text, we need to go back to Genesis and go through the rest of the Gospels and go through the book of Acts and go through the rest of the New Testament. And as we do, we will find themes echoed over and over. Themes about compassion, themes about politics and economics, themes about relationship with outsiders, themes about family relationships and children and vulnerability, themes about seeing the world otherwise. The Christmas story is, in fact, one of the best Christmas gifts we could possibly have.
Before you leave, Chris, if you can switch me over to host, that would be good. Thank you. Thanks for playing that for us. So, anything spur some thoughts or something new for you in that video? I'll let you guys raise a hand or just unmute yourself. Go ahead, Norma.
Oh, I was just thinking about the Magi and her expressions about, kings, or they weren't really kings like we think, and thinking of it as a different kind of kingdom. And she just had a couple of enlightening things, about that, or to kind of look at that in a different way and not such a concrete way that we I sometimes do things. So
thank you. Anyone else? Has anyone thought of the, as we always like to call the Magi wise men, as being fools?
Mm-hmm.
No. No, I don't know where I heard it, but weren't they kind of astrologists or something? I mean, they were wise men. So weren't
Yes.
They followed stars, right?
Yes, they did. They were, the Magi at that time were astrologers, and astrologers were considered what we would consider scientists.
Okay.
they were people who studied the skies and the stars and different and things. And they, yeah, they were considered scientists. So they were considered part of the knowledgeable people. They were coming into the story. They were also foreigners. So, and when she started talking about them as being fools, to me, I was like, oh, so this is kind of like, you know, the scientist who's brilliant but doesn't know how to, you know, tie his shoes type thing, you know. Some of those, and they weren't really thinking in lines of, well, if this is King Herod and he's king of the Jews, if I ask about a king of the Jews, I might tick him off. You know, they were just very focused on their mission of finding this new king of the Jews that was to be around. So, but yeah, that was new to me too. And you're right, they were astrologists and were considered scientists at that time. Anyone else?
I think it's good also to look at the whole Bible, as she said, or in context, and like Joanne saying the story of Joseph, or Delzy saying the Moses, that it just makes us realize how much connection there is through many, many stories, probably all stories, but it's why it's good to study like this, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree. Kay or Jerry?
I was thinking this, the authors of Luke and Matthew, maybe tying those older stories into it as well, so people had a comfort with it. They could relate to it. They're thinking about, you know, Moses being, you know, saved out of things and so forth. So I just was thinking that based on their audience and so forth, they might have been writing the story to include those similarities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. There's a, you know, if you think about when you read materials, if you read something that is completely foreign to any knowledge you have, think about how hard it is to understand that. But if you read something that you can go, oh, well, this is kind of like something that you kind of remember from the past or some other knowledge base, if you can make those connections, then you can go on to understand this new idea because you've kind of got this connection to the old one. So I think they were really quite masterful at doing that. And for me, who in the past, I just never really had a great appreciation for the Old Testament, I'm like, okay, I'm really getting that. There's a lot of really cool stuff there that I just didn't get before. And she really does, I think, a fantastic job of doing that. What did you think about the star? Her discussion about the star? Does that go ahead?
About 4,000 years ago, when I was a student at Gustavus, I took an astronomy course by Professor Carlos Kaufmanis. Some of you may have heard of him in the past.
Who's at the U too.
And then after a period of years, I guess he had to run away from Gustavus and went to the University of Minnesota. But he put on many programs around the Christmas season called the Star of Bethlehem. And he, even way back then, all these many years ago, was putting the technical astronomy technology behind the Star of Bethlehem, and how at the time of Jesus' birth, this event took place in the Middle East. So it's been a very impressive thing on me, and I remember that very clearly. And Pat and I went to several of his other Christmas story, Star of Bethlehem presentations, which he did every year. And if you have interest, look up Carlos Kaufmanis, and he wrote some books, of course, but he has a very interesting presentation on the technology, astronomy behind the Star of Bethlehem.
How do you spell Kaufmanis?
Oh my.
Does it start with a K?
Yeah.
It's Kaufman, maybe US,
Yeah.
Kaufmanis, US.
Okay, that gets me closer to where I was going with it. So, okay.
And God Save Us or Gustavus, then you'll maybe get it.
That's Kuas.
KAU.
Yeah, MAS, I
Okay.
think.
Okay, I'll see if I can't find that and send it out, or if someone else does. They could do the same. Delzy.
Well, tomorrow is supposed to be when the two planets get together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, somebody has said, was maybe what the Christmas star was. I don't know if that's what that scientist had said, but I had never, I'd heard they were stars. I hadn't heard they were two planets together. But that's interesting. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. I hope it's not cloudy so we can look at it.
Yeah, I agree.
'Cause I remember always looking for the Star of Bethlehem as a little girl, and I think I usually saw the North Star. But, I looked for the brightest star out there. But it was interesting that she said if the star stopped, it would burn everything around. I'd never thought of that because it's so far away. I didn't think it would burn everything.
Well, and then, you're thinking, but it's way up in the sky. But then it's going to look like it's over everything, no matter what thing you look at. But I had never heard the discussion of that in those days, people thought of stars as sentient beings. And then it made me think, so what am I all missing? Because I am so into the concreteness of stuff that, do I just not see it? And so to me, when she brings that up, to me, it's okay, so now what do I need to pay attention to? What am I missing? Because I'm only looking with this little science view about something, because it's more than just a science. Just like the creation story, if you look at it only from the perspective of science, you miss out on the biggest part of creation stories. So here again is another reminder to me to look at it from a different lens than that. Not that I discard it. It's possible that there was an actual star that got them close, and then the stars, as they thought of stars, took over. We don't know. But the fact that there was something guiding them and that they followed it, that they were so enthralled and that they so much wanted to be there, that's, to me, maybe the bigger story. Is there anything else that she mentioned that she either talked about or said that, she said we covered a lot of stuff, or something that she mentioned that we still could talk about, like the genealogy, or the John the Baptist story, or more about Mary or Joseph, were some of the things she mentioned. Anything there that sparked a curiosity for you?
Two things, from the frivolous to the serious. Frivolous, some time ago, I was prompted to think about the Magi and how their behavior, some people think, was very typical male. They bring to the baby frankincense and myrrh and gold, where if they'd been women, they would have brought diapers and baby oil and clothes. But that's the frivolous part. The more serious part is I have never experienced Christmas, nor a Christmas pageant, in a European country. I'm wondering if they blend the two stories together in similar fashion, if any of our group have ever experienced either a pageant or just Christmas in another country.
Oh, that's a really good question. I have not had the opportunity to do that. and yeah, I don't know. That would be something interesting to look up.
I do discover on occasion that particularly as related to Christianity, there is an American, we as Americans have put particular flavor to Christianity. That is, I met with foreign students and they would talk about their Christian observances. They tended to be different and tended to, again, reflect their own culture as opposed to where we Americans can begin to believe that everyone does it the way we do it.
That's a really good point. And that's something that when we start talking about even within our country, the differences of cultural, racial, whatever, that how much of our church practices are really cultural and not faith. And to make those discernments, that, and not that having the culture you have is wrong, but understanding that sometimes that culture can also be off-putting if it's not inclusive, or if you don't also accept the cultural components of the way other people practice the faith. So that's a really interesting point. And also something that I ran across in, there's a livinglutheran.org. It's a magazine, but you can also, I think, read many articles online. And in this most recent issue, they had a one that's called Message of Solidarity, and it's a Palestinian interpretation of the Nativity. And it's just a 2-pager, but they really talk about the story of Christmas as being a very subversive message. And as far as and they have like 4 or 5 points. But they say, finally, the Magi, the story of the Magi paying homage to Jesus, functions as a critique of Roman imperialism because Persia was the enemy of Rome. Author Courtney Roberts points out in The Star of the Magi, a book published in 2007, that Magi were Zoroastrian priests skilled in interpreting dreams and understanding astrology. Looking for a king, these Magi went not to Rome, but to Bethlehem, which assured Matthew's audience that Jesus's divinity and kingship were superior to that of Augustus. The nativity of Jesus Christ was a subversive act on the Roman imperial power and unjust peace. Jesus' birth stands against all kinds of systemic injustices and military occupation, and it is a message of solidarity with the disadvantaged. So that's just part of the article. It's a very interesting article, and it was written by a pastor, Levine Saras, who is a pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Wausau, Wisconsin. She was born and raised in Bethlehem. So I can see if I can link this to send you. Otherwise, you should be able to look it up as well. But great point of how it's looked at, how the story's looked at from, and how it might be the story told. Again, they used to act out the stories. We do that on some of the things. Easter and Christmas stories seem to be the big things that we act out, as opposed to a lot of the other stories. Not sure how we'd act out Jonah and the whale, but so anyway, anything else that comes to mind?
One other thing that I thought of last week, I think, after she talked about the fact that Christmas probably really wasn't in December or, in our cold time. I would love to hear, because Monty lived in Australia for a few years, what Christmas was like from living in the Southern Hemisphere, but still in a culture that's not that different from America, compared to like South America, for instance. Anyway, it's probably kind of late for that, but it just occurred to me that that would be a really interesting perspective on how they celebrated.
That would be.
I think you'd love to share. I think you'd love to share that.
Yeah, it's too bad we didn't think about that beforehand. We could have asked him to come on in. Pastor Peter, did
He
you
might
have
be
any?
willing to. Yeah, he might be willing to drum something up though too. I'll mention that to him, Kay.
Pastor Peter, did you have any comments you wanted to make at all?
Well, the one that just came to mind. So you talked about kind of the performance, what we act out or dramatize, and apparently one of the ones that's really interesting that that people in Jewish communities often will act out is the story of Esther. I have two professors that I was working with, but they do a really interesting kind of almost it's a very comedic retelling of the Esther story, and a lot about kind of the power dynamics of Persia and Judaism, and kind of a lot of really interesting kind of role reversals and how the opposites are lifted up. That I know, it's not, that has not at all been a story that has been that I've heard or seen before, but apparently in Jewish communities, that's like one that everybody knows and reads, and communities act out publicly. But I think the other, and then the other point that I think she really hit on, and I think this mirrors a lot of the Moses story, but really and that I hadn't really thought a lot about, was the whole idea of how Jesus reflects on the slaughter of the innocents, how Jesus, his survival amidst that, what that means for the character and the scope of his ministry, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, where whenever you did it to the least of these, right? That's the line that we hear at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Whenever you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Which, I mean, I cannot imagine more of a least of these than the slaughter of the innocents. So yeah, that was just a really interesting and striking point that I hadn't really made that connection, when so much of, I think, what she said about the connections to Matthew's gospel and to the story of Moses are just like parallel. Even the Sermon on the Mount, where in Luke's gospel it's the Sermon on the Plain. The Sermon on the Mount is mirroring again this really the reflection of the Beatitudes as a reflection of the commandments.
Yeah.
So just some really interesting stuff there too.
Sounds like we're going to
I
have some acting out of sermons pretty soon.
We did the dance. That might be about as far as it goes that last week, which is still online. For as long as I let it be online, I think.
Was there something else, Peter?
No, that was all. That was the main ones. I think that is I think the way that Matthew starts that story, and particularly kind of that it's starting out of such a tragic, the tragic situation of Jesus living and all these other kids dying. It's a really, I think, like you were saying with that, the story of the pastor from Bethlehem too, sharing about just how much this upends our sense of systemic injustice, and shapes a lot of the ministry of Jesus.
She also repeats in here again how important it was for Joseph cared for the baby Jesus by taking him down to Egypt.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of that idea of relationship, and it's not just a one-way street, that beyond with our relationship, we need to care for God. And what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really thought of that before. What does it mean to care for God?
Mm-hmm. And that God would allow us to care for God.
Right. And
which is really, yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
by caring for others, and that's a question that came up, in our wonderings questions that kind of brought us to what things do we want to look at this year. One of them was, well, how do I care for God? Well, by caring for others. And again, it's that whole storyline that continues to go through time and time again. She talks about some of the themes that were in here. Compassion, relationships with outsiders, family. Some of the stories that are out there assume that Mary was all alone to give birth, but they traveled in family groups. So, she might have had some aunt or something there helping give birth. I don't think they would have just abandoned her there. It's not like they're insulary family units like we have become. Think about it. I don't have any family nearby. Well, that just wasn't what they did. They may have even had family down there. So thinking about all those different things, how does that change your impression of what the story means? I guess is a question for you. Anyone have anything they'd like to share on that? What the story means, or a new way of looking at it for you? I see a lot of smiles.
Well, Penny, you've allowed the Magi to get off the hook. We will assume that the relatives have provided the diapers and the clothes, and
Okay.
And he may be weaned and potty trained by the time the Magi got there.
That's true. That's very true. We don't know. And I missed sending a picture that Rita had sent that I thought of a nativity that it says it's from Edgewood Review on Books. So I'm going to hold it up.
Did I send that one? Maybe it was
I think you sent it through Facebook to me. But Joseph is dealing with the fussy baby, and Mary is out for the count. And that is very sweet. Sometimes we forget in the story that this is human beings. There's real humanity here. This, dealing with everything that's human, everything that's flesh, to remember that. One of the other things that she didn't mention in the video, but she talks about in the book, and it's about the genealogies. And I'll let you kind of take a look at those on your own time if you want. But Matthew starts out with the genealogy. I think. Isn't he the one that starts with it? Yeah. Let me get my page here. Sorry. Matthew starts out with the genealogy, and he starts with Abraham and works his way down. And in his genealogy, there are women. There are people who are, and And the women come from various backgrounds, various experiences. One is a Canaanite, one is a Moabite, one is a Hittite. Abraham himself began as a pagan, she mentions. So already infiltrating the idea that there were Gentiles within the lineage and the importance of that. And it starts out with that in the story, and that's the focus, where Luke tells us all these different things, the birth, Jesus being presented to the temple, and doesn't get into the genealogy until after his baptism. And he starts with Jesus and goes backwards. And if you look at them, there's not agreement between things. And so again, knowing what their emphasis is on the genealogy can also give you a clue as to what the emphasis is on what the point of their stories are about. You know, is it about kingly rule? Is it about the fight against kingly rule? As they look at the genealogy in Matthew, the people of that time know that, oh, there's a second Joseph, son of Jacob. Oh, he dreamed dreams. Joseph is going to dream dreams too. Jesus's dad is going to dream dreams as well. And the relocation stories as well. And so it's an area that oftentimes it's like, oh, it's just a bunch of names. We'll just skip through it. At least that's mine. You guys probably all read the genealogies, can pronounce all the names correctly. I wouldn't even begin to want to read that out loud to you unless you wanted a comedy act. But so something that, you know, if you're interested, I would say take a look at it and see what you discover. Anything else? So if there is one thing new out of hearing her study, oh, Jerry, thank you.
Yeah, I was just thinking all this, if you want to call it scientific or whatever you want to call it, looking into all this stuff. And I just like to look at it as the birth in a very humble way of Jesus. And if it's just a story, it could be true or it could be made up, but it's just a good story of how humble God was to come to earth that way.
Yeah, we didn't have to go to God. God came to us.
Right.
In a way that we could understand. Yeah, good point, Jerry. That kind of bodes to my question that I was going to ask. So after hearing these sessions and having these discussions, is there something new or something that, you know, just becomes more grounded for you about what these stories and events means to you? Or what it does to your faith? I know it's not a fluffy question necessarily.
Well, she said that as Christians, we can't listen to the Christmas and Easter. We can't just listen to and go Christmas and Easter to church. We have to practice it all year round. And that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many people. We had a pastor that always called them C&E people, and that just come Christmas and Easter. So, but we need to practice Christmas and Easter every day, which is hard to do.
Yes. But the whole idea of how that ties back into so much of the Old Testament is kind of a reminder that it's not just a story in and of itself. There's all this connection. Thank you. Anyone else? Joanne, you looked like you were maybe ready to say something. Was that true or no? Oh, you're muted. Okay. Anyone?
No, I sort of forgot what I was going to say.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking about something that I read quite a while ago, describing the ancient Hebrew people. It probably follows through even to now, but he called them God intoxicated people. And they never thought of God as out there. God was right here with them every minute. And I think that whole perspective, when you read their stories, that is a reflection of, God is with us. We talked about how what we can do for God. Well, if God is with us, then it won't be a big problem. I'm done.
Thank you. No, that was really good. Thank you. Well, it's 12 o'clock. There's one other little thing here. Again, it was from this issue of Living Lutheran, and the article is The Humanity of the Nativity. And it references Christmas book of Luther, emphasizes the story's realism. This is how the author put it. And there was just one little section that he wrote that I thought would be interesting. Luther argues the difficult realities of human experience are where God meets us through the Christ child. The crux of Luther's message on Advent and Christmas is this: God comes down for us. Consider each part of that statement. God. It is God in flesh who's in the manger. The lowliness of God offends human reason, but should not offend us. Comes down. God does not demand that we ascend to heaven. Rather, God comes to us, into our lives, our situations, our sufferings, for us. God in Christ comes to do something for us. Christ is not simply an example. Rather, he actively changes our lives. In this way, Luther emphasized that we should feel comforted rather than alarmed by the notion of God joining us in our struggles. I would not have contemplated the deity of Christ, the majesty of Christ, but rather his flesh, Luther wrote in Nativity. Look upon the baby Jesus. Divinity may terrify man. Inexpressible majesty will crush him. That is why Christ took on our humanity, save our sin, that he should not terrify us, but rather that with love and favor, he should console and confirm. And then the author writes, in these words, Luther cautions his audience and us today not to think of ourselves as having transcended our humanity. If only I had been there, how quick I would have been to help the baby. I would have washed his linen. You say that because you know how Christ is, but if you had been there at that time, you would have done no better than the people of Bethlehem. Why don't you do it now? You have Christ in your neighbor. So, and there's more in that, but I just thought that was a really nice summary of a way of thinking about Christmas as we go forward.
Penny, I believe we have that Luther book in the library.
Oh.
And it's just a small book. I mean, I can visualize it, but if anyone should want it, I would be happy to pick it up for you. So,
well, thank you. Yeah, it's just, again, something I didn't know existed. And yeah, just very nice. So with that, unless anyone else has something to share, thank you all so much for coming. I just love that you're willing to take time out on your Sunday mornings to join us. And I know there are many people who I've heard do check us out afterwards because of scheduling and stuff. But I just really am blessed that you have joined us on Sundays, and wish you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you. And we will be back on January 3rd. And the month of January is going to focus on mission and homelessness. And Michelle Hermanson is going to speak on January 3rd about accompaniment mission and what that means and how missions differ. And then we'll be having speakers come in from different places about different ways of attending to homelessness and other things like that. So I hope you continue to come and have a great Christmas, and maybe we'll see you out at the drive-in.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.